The man who brought her to the town of redemption was small and weaselly, with eyes that darted about as if constantly looking for an escape or an opportunity. Leeway followed a step behind him, her gaze fixed on the dusty planks of the boardwalk, her hands clenched tight inside the sleeves of a worn beige prairie dress that was not her own. She was 20 years old, and her life had become a ledger of transactions she had no power to refuse. The final entry was about to be made. The townspeople stopped to stare, their faces a mixture of crude curiosity and pity. They saw a fragile, foreign doll, breakable and out of place beneath the vast, unforgiving sky. They saw the end of her journey and the beginning of something else. He was waiting for them in front of the general store, a man who seemed less born of a woman and more carved from the mountain itself. He was huge, a giant of a man with shoulders as broad as a doorway and a chest thick with muscle earned from a life of felling timber. His hair and beard were long and unruly, the color of dark earth, and his eyes, when they finally lifted to meet hers, were a startling, clear gray, like stones at the bottom of a winter creek. He did not smile. He did not speak. He simply stood there, his presence silencing the whispers around them. The Weasley man shoved a piece of paper into the lumberjack's hand. "All in order. Paid in full to the company." The lumberjack, Finn, unfolded the paper, his massive, calloused fingers surprisingly gentle with the thin sheet. He read it slowly, his expression unchanging. Then he folded it once, tucked it into his pocket, and reached into a leather pouch at his belt. He counted out the coins, his movements deliberate, final. The clink of the metal was the sound of her life being signed away. The deal was done. Finn's gaze settled on her again, and for the first time she felt it was not an assessment of property, but a question. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, not to the man beside her, but up the trail that led away from the town, towards the deep green shadows of the mountains. The message was clear. Follow. And so she did, leaving the whispers and the staring faces of redemption behind, walking into the wilderness with a silent giant she now belonged to. The path was steep and the air grew thin, smelling of pine and damp earth. He never once looked back to see if she was keeping pace, yet his stride, long and powerful, was measured, as if he knew exactly the length of her smaller, more hesitant steps. He was a force of nature, and she was a ghost trailing in his wake. They walked for what felt like an eternity, the silence between them broken only by the crunch of their boots on the trail and the sigh of the wind through the tall pines. The world of men fell away below, replaced by a world of trees and rock and sky. Finally, they came to a small clearing where a cabin stood, solid and square against the wilderness. It was made of thick, hand-hewn logs, with a stone chimney breathing a thin plume of smoke into the evening air. It was a lonely place, a fortress of solitude. Finn pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped aside, a silent invitation for her to enter. The inside was sparse, almost monastic. A single room held a sturdy wooden bed covered with a thick patchwork quilt, a small table with 2 chairs, and a massive stone hearth where a low fire crackled. Everything was clean, ordered, and built to last. The air was warm and smelled of wood smoke and something else, something clean like dried herbs. He moved to the fire, adding a log from a neat stack beside the hearth. His size seemed to fill the small space, yet he moved with a quiet economy, a grace that belied his immense strength. Leeway remained by the door, her hands still hidden in her sleeves, a visitor in a life that was now supposed to be hers. She watched him, cataloging every detail. The worn leather of his boots, the frayed cuffs of his flannel shirt, the way the firelight caught in his wild hair. She was afraid, a deep, cold fear that had been her constant companion for months. But here, in this quiet, isolated place, another feeling began to surface, a profound and weary curiosity. What would this man, this mountain of a man, do now? He gestured toward one of the chairs at the table. She moved slowly, her body stiff, and sat down, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. He filled a tin kettle with water from a bucket and set it on a hook over the fire. He did not look at her, but she felt his awareness of her in the room. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken questions. He was the buyer. She was the bought. The nature of their contract was brutally simple. Finally, he turned from the fire, his gray eyes finding hers in the dim light. His voice, when it came, was a low rumble, like rock shifting deep underground. You are safe here. It wasn't a promise of kindness. It wasn't an offer of comfort. It was a statement of fact, plain and unadorned, delivered with the same solid certainty as the log walls around them. And in that moment, the first thread in the tightly woven knot of her terror began to loosen. He served a simple meal of rabbit stew, ladling it into 2 wooden bowls. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons and the crackle of the fire. The stew was rich and savory, and Lee-Wei realized she was ravenously hungry. When they finished, Finn took the bowls, washed them in a basin of water, and set them aside to dry. The rituals of the evening were simple, practical, and offered no clue as to what he was thinking. With the meal cleared away, the night closed in, and the small cabin seemed to shrink. The single bed against the far wall became the center of the room, an unavoidable fact. This was their wedding night. A transaction had been made, and payment was due. Lee-Wei's hands grew cold, and the fear she thought had receded came rushing back, a bitter taste in her mouth. She braced herself, schooling her features into a mask of calm acceptance, a mask she had learned to wear long ago. She would endure this as she had endured everything else. Finn stood by the fire, his broad back to her, staring into the flames. The light flickered across his powerful shoulders, making him seem even larger, a primal figure of shadow and flame. He stood there for a long time, so long that she began to think he had forgotten she was there. Then he moved. He walked not towards the bed, but to a large wooden chest in the corner of the room. He lifted the heavy lid and pulled out a thick pile of furs and 2 heavy wool blankets. He carried them to the hearth, spreading them carefully on the floorboards in front of the dying fire, creating a thick, soft pallet. He then walked to the bed, took one of the 2 pillows, and placed it at the head of the furs on the floor. He straightened up and finally looked at her. His face was unreadable in the shifting shadows, his gray eyes holding hers for a long, silent moment. "The bed is yours," he said, his voice quiet but clear in the still room. "I will sleep here." Without another word, he turned his back to her, giving her the privacy of the entire cabin. He sat down on the pallet, pulled off his heavy boots, and lay down, wrapping himself in one of the blankets. Within minutes, the slow, deep rhythm of his breathing filled the silence. Lee-Wei stood frozen, her mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. She had prepared for brutality, for indifference, for the cold finality of a contract fulfilled. She had not prepared for this, for decency, for a quiet, profound act of respect from a man who owed her none. She looked at the empty bed, then at the massive form of the man sleeping on the floor to protect her honor. And in the warm, firelit cabin, surrounded by a vast and lonely wilderness, a fragile seed of hope, something she thought had died in her long ago, began to stir. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. a silent dance of shared existence. Finn would rise before the sun, his movements quiet as he stoked the fire and put on his boots. He would leave the cabin with his axe over his shoulder and not return until the sky was streaked with the colors of dusk. Leeway would wake to the warmth he left behind. Her world was the cabin and the small clearing around it. She found a routine that was hers alone. She swept the floors, tended the small vegetable patch she discovered behind the cabin, and learned to cook with the supplies he kept in a small pantry. She mended his clothes, her small, neat stitches a stark contrast to the rough, utilitarian fabric. They rarely spoke. Their communication was a language of actions. Every morning she would find a bucket of fresh, cold water on the porch, drawn from the spring. Every evening he would find a hot meal waiting on the table, a silent offering of gratitude and care. One afternoon he came back from the forest earlier than usual. He didn't say anything, but simply placed a handful of wild strawberries on the table. They were small and impossibly sweet. She ate them one by one, the taste a burst of unexpected joy. Another day she found a terrible gash in the sleeve of his favorite shirt. She worked on it for hours by the firelight, her needle flashing, until the tear was gone, replaced by a seam so perfect it was nearly invisible. When he put it on the next morning, he paused, his fingers tracing the line of her work. He glanced at her, a flicker of something, surprise, appreciation, in his gray eyes, before he gave a slight nod and left for the woods. Trust was not something they discussed. It was something they built, log by log, stitch by stitch, day by silent day. She learned the sounds of his life, the steady thud of his axe echoing from the mountainside, the heavy tread of his boots on the porch, the low rumble of his voice when he occasionally spoke to himself while sharpening a tool. He in turn learned her quiet presence, the scent of baking bread that now filled the cabin, the way she arranged wildflowers in a tin cup on the windowsill. They were two solitary people, living in a shared solitude that was slowly, imperceptibly, becoming something else. It was no longer just his home. It was becoming theirs. And the space between the bed and the floor, while still present, no longer felt like a chasm of fear, but a quiet, respectful distance that he had chosen to honor. After 2 months on the mountain, their supplies ran low. The trip to Redemption was unavoidable. The thought of returning to that place, to the staring eyes and the whispers, filled Leeway with a quiet dread. Finn seemed to feel it too. A tension settled over him the morning they were to leave. He simply said, "Stay close," as they started down the familiar trail. The town was just as she remembered it. A dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings, a place that felt both temporary and deeply entrenched in its own harsh judgments. As they walked towards the general store, the whispers started again. Heads turned. Men on the boardwalk stopped their conversations to watch them pass. Leeway kept her eyes down, focusing on the scuffed toes of her boots, trying to make herself as small as possible. But she could feel his presence beside her, a solid, unmovable wall. He was not ashamed. He walked as if he owned the mountain he had just ascended, his stride even and sure. Inside the store, the air was thick with the smells of coffee, leather, and dried goods. Finn handed a list to the proprietor, who filled their order with a forced, nervous politeness. As they were about to leave, a man blocked their path. He was well dressed in a dark suit, his face fleshy, and his smile thin and unpleasant. Leeway recognized him instantly. He was the man who ran the mining company, the man whose name was on the paper that had sealed her fate. "Well, well," the man, Mr. Harding said, his voice slick with condescension. He ignored Finn completely, his eyes roaming over Leeway in a way that made her skin crawl. Heard you bought yourself a wife, Finn. A quiet one. Finn didn't answer. He simply shifted his position, moving to stand slightly in front of her, a subtle but absolute barrier. The movement was all the answer Harding needed. Harding's sneer deepened. Doesn't she speak? Or did you buy one that comes without a voice? It was then that Finn spoke, his voice not loud, but carrying a weight that made the entire store fall silent. She is my wife. He paused, his gray eyes locking with Harding's. Her name is Leeway. It was the first time he had said her name aloud to anyone. It was the first time he had claimed her, not as property, but as a person, as his. The words hung in the air, a declaration of war and of loyalty. Harding's smile faltered. He was a man used to power, but the raw, physical power radiating from the lumberjack was something he couldn't bully or buy. He took a half step back, his bravado crumbling. Just making conversation, he muttered, before turning and striding out of the store. The silence he left behind was deafening. Finn paid for their supplies, and they walked out into the sunlight, the eyes of the town following their every move. The trip back up the mountain was as silent as the one down, but this time the silence felt different. It was charged with the echo of his words. Her name is Leeway. The tension from the encounter in town followed them back up the mountain, a clinging, unpleasant residue. The quiet of the cabin, which had once been a comfort, now felt heavy with unspoken things. That night, a summer storm broke with sudden violence. Rain hammered against the roof, and the wind howled through the pines like a grieving animal. Leeway sat at the table, her hands clenched in her lap, flinching with every brilliant flash of lightning and the bone-rattling crack of thunder that followed. The storm outside was a mirror to the turmoil she felt within. From his pallet on the floor, Finn watched her. He saw the tremor in her shoulders, the way she held her breath, waiting for the next assault from the sky. He could have said nothing, could have let her endure it in silence as they endured everything else, but he didn't. The wind sounds different in a spruce than it does in a pine, he said, his voice a low counterpoint to the raging storm. Leeway looked over at him, startled. He was lying on his side, propped up on an elbow, his face calm in the flickering firelight. The spruce needles are short and stiff. They make a hissing sound. The pine needles are long. They whisper more. He continued to speak, his voice a steady, grounding rumble. He told her about the way lightning would sometimes strike the tallest oak trees, splitting them clean in two. He told her how the rain would swell the creek and how the sound of it would change from a trickle to a roar. He didn't talk about Mr. Harding. He didn't talk about the town or the whispers or the piece of paper that had brought her here. He spoke of the mountain, of his world. He named the trees and the animals and the signs of the changing seasons. What are your thoughts on how small, quiet acts can sometimes build more trust than grand declarations? He was filling the terrifying noise of the storm with the calm, certain knowledge of his home, and in doing so, he was inviting her in, sharing its secrets with her. Leeway listened, her fear slowly receding. The thunder still crashed, but it was muffled now by the deep, steady cadence of his voice. He was building a shelter for her, not of logs and stone, but of words. It was the longest he had ever spoken to her, and every word was a gift, a quiet reassurance that here, in this wild place, she was not alone. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin, a different kind of quiet had settled. A peace born not of silence, but of a shared, gentle voice in the dark. As summer bled into autumn, a chill began to creep into the mountain air. The mornings were laced with frost, and the vibrant green of the forest began to fade to gold and rust. Leeway's thin beige dress, the last remnant of her old life, offered little protection against the growing cold. She never complained, but Finn noticed the way she hugged her arms to her chest, the slight shiver that would run through her as she stepped outside to fetch water. He was a man who noticed things, a man who lived by observing the subtle shifts in the world around him. One afternoon, he returned from a trip to town with the usual sacks of flour and salt, but also with a large, heavy parcel wrapped in brown paper. He set it on the table without a word, then went about his usual task of stacking the firewood he had brought up. Leeway approached the table hesitantly. She slowly unwrapped the paper. Inside was a bolt of the most beautiful fabric she had ever touched. It was thick, soft wool, the color of a midnight sky, a deep and comforting blue. Beneath it was a small wooden box containing an assortment of sharp new needles and spools of dark thread. It was not a frivolous gift. It was practical. It was a necessity. But it was also so much more. It was an acknowledgment of her comfort, of her future here. It was a promise of warmth against the coming winter. It was a gesture of profound, unspoken care. She ran her hand over the soft wool, her heart swelling with an emotion so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. She looked up at him as he came back inside, his face shadowed and unreadable as always. "It is good wool," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He grunted in response, turning away to busy himself at the hearth, but not before she saw the tips of his ears turn a deep red. "Thank you, Finn," she added, saying his name for the first time. He stopped what he was doing and stood very still, his back to her. He simply nodded, a short, sharp dip of his head. But in that small, awkward moment, the final wall between them crumbled. The arrangement, the contract, the silent agreement, it was all gone, washed away by a bolt of blue wool and a quiet, heartfelt thank you. That evening she began to cut the fabric by the light of the fire, the fine material a stark contrast to the rough-hewn table. He sat on his pallet, watching her, the silence between them no longer empty, but filled with a new, tender warmth. Mr. Harding was not a man who forgot a slight. He saw Finn's public claim of Leeway not as a declaration of marriage, but as a challenge to his own authority and redemption. He saw Leeway not as a person, but as an exotic possession that the lumberjack didn't deserve. One afternoon, when the sun was low in the sky and the woods were deep with shadow, he decided to act. He and two of his hired men rode up the trail to the cabin, confident they would find the woman alone. They assumed Finn would be miles away, felling timber until dusk. They were wrong. Leeway was in the garden, gathering the last of the hardy root vegetables for their winter stores. When she heard the sound of horses, she straightened up, her heart beginning to pound. She saw Harding dismount, a smug, predatory smile on his face. "Well now," he called out, his voice echoing unnaturally in the quiet clearing. "Looks like your mountain man isn't here to protect you now." His men stayed on their horses, their expressions a mixture of amusement and menace. They were watching a game, and they were certain of the outcome. But Leeway was not the same woman who had followed a stranger up this mountain months ago. This was her home. She had poured her work, her care, her very self into this small patch of earth. She did not run. She stood her ground, her chin held high, the dirt still on her hands. "You should not be here," she said, her voice clear and steady. Harding laughed. "I go where I please, and I think it's time you came down from this mountain. A pretty thing like you belongs in town." He took a step toward her, his intentions clear. It was then that a sound came from the tree line at the edge of the clearing. It was the soft, almost silent fall of a footstep. Finn emerged from the deep shadows, his axe held loosely in one hand, its polished head glinting in the fading light. He hadn't been far at all. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He simply walked toward them, his gray eyes fixed on Harding, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. The air crackled with his silent rage. He was the mountain itself, risen to defend its own. "Leave," he said. The word was not a request. It was a command, spoken in a voice so low and dangerous it seemed to shake the very ground. Harding and his men froze. The smugness vanished from their faces, replaced by a primal fear. They saw no longer a simple lumberjack, but an elemental force of violence, barely contained. Without another word, Harding scrambled back onto his horse. He and his men turned and fled, galloping back down the trail in a clatter of panicked hooves, leaving only dust and the ringing silence behind them. Finn did not watch them go. His eyes were only on Lee Wei, checking to see that she was unharmed. The violent intrusion shattered the peace of their world. After Harding and his men had fled, Finn walked to the edge of the clearing and stood for a long time, staring down the trail, his axe still in his hand. Lee Wei went back to her work in the garden, her hands trembling slightly, but her movements sure and steady. When dusk finally fell, they went inside the cabin. The silence that settled between them was different from any they had shared before. It was not the silence of strangers, nor the comfortable silence of companions. It was a heavy, charged silence, thick with everything that had happened and everything that remained unsaid. He couldn't settle. He paced the length of the small room, from the door to the hearth and back again, his heavy boots thudding on the floorboards. He was a caged animal, his protective instincts roaring. Lee Wei sat at the table, watching him, her heart aching for his turmoil. Finally, he stopped in the center of the room and looked at her, his face etched with a fierce, raw emotion. "He will not bother you again," he vowed, his voice rough. He took a deep breath, the words coming with great difficulty, as if he were pulling them up from the very bedrock of his soul. "This place, this is your home now." He swallowed hard, his gaze unwavering. "You are not a purchase." His voice cracked on the last word. "You are my wife." The simple, powerful truth of it hung in the air between them. He had said it in town to defy another man, but he said it now for her, and for himself. It was a confession, an apology, and a plea, all in one. Lee Wei stood up slowly. She looked at him, at this giant, gentle man who had guarded her safety and her honor from the very first night. She saw past the wild hair and the formidable strength to the deep, steady heart within. Without a word, she walked to his pallet of furs on the floor. She bent down and picked up the pillow, the one he had used every single night. She held it for a moment, then turned and walked to the bed. She placed his pillow on the empty side of the mattress, next to her own. She smoothed the patchwork quilt, her movements calm and deliberate. Then she looked at him. She didn't need to speak. The gesture was an answer, an invitation, an acceptance. It was everything. He stood frozen, watching her, his eyes wide with a vulnerable hope she had never seen in him before. Slowly, as if waking from a long dream, he took a step, and then another, crossing the small space that had separated them for so long. The distance between the floor and the bed was finally closed. The first snow of winter began to fall that night, soft, silent flakes drifting down from a slate-gray sky. It covered the mountain in a blanket of pure white, muffling the world, creating a sense of profound peace and isolation. Inside the cabin, a new warmth bloomed, a gentle heat that had nothing to do with the glowing embers in the hearth. The awkwardness of strangers had long since faded, replaced by the quiet intimacy of two people who had found a home in each other. They had forged their own language, one that existed in the spaces between words. It was in the way he would reach for her hand across the table, his calloused fingers wrapping gently around hers. It was in the way she would lean against his solid warmth as they watched the snow fall, her head resting on his shoulder. He was no longer just a lumberjack, a silent, imposing figure. He was Finn, a man whose quietness was a sign of depth, not emptiness, and whose strength was matched only by his decency. And she was no longer the girl who was sold, a fragile refugee from a broken life. She was Leeway, a woman of resilience and grace, whose steadfast presence had turned a lonely cabin into a loving home. Their days continued in their familiar rhythm, but now it was a rhythm of partnership. They worked together to prepare for the long winter, their movements synchronized, their purpose shared. The world outside, with its cruel men and its harsh judgments, felt 1,000 miles away, a half-remembered bad dream. Here, on their mountain, sealed in by the snow, they had everything they needed. They had built a life not from a contract or from obligation, but from 1,000 small acts of kindness, loyalty, and unspoken love. They had learned that a home is not a place you are given, but a place you build, beam by beam, with trust and with care. And love, they discovered, was not a sudden fire, but a slow, steady warmth, kindled in the darkest of nights and strong enough to last a lifetime. The snow kept falling, and in the heart of the wilderness, in a small cabin filled with light, their life together had truly begun. It was a simple life, a hard life, and a beautiful life, and it was enough. It was everything.